Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining that session. I'm Stephane Bazire. I'm the head of ESG at Silverstone Circuit. And today we're going to talk about Shift to Zero, ESG strategy and decarbonization roadmap, and the Silverstone case, which actually we'll probably not talk about today because there is another session, within a month's time. We will then complete those two sessions. So I will do a quick intro for you to get to know who I am. And then, we'll get into a little bit, the origin, the challenges, the opportunities around sustainability in sport. So the point 3 and 4 will be more, for the next sessions, but, you can always, put some questions in the chat, and then, I'll try, to answer it as much as I can, even though I don't see it, on my screen right now, but I'm sure that Pedro will help me if I need anything. So let's start, So yes, this is me, Stephane Bazire. I've been the head of ESG at Silverstone for 4 years now, back in 2021. More than 20 years, I'm involved in sports and sustainability. You can find me on LinkedIn if you want to. And then I just wanted, to give you like a quick overview of what I've been doing, over the years. Since I've graduated, in high school, and then, became who I am or what I'm doing now. So very much involved in tennis, very much involved in sports. Since day one. I wish I could have been, a professional tennis player. But no, I decided, to join more like the organization side. My local tennis club back in Normandy at that time was having a tennis ATP event. I was the ball boys manager there. That's how, really I started, looking at how I can get, a career within sports management. So joined the ITF, benefiting from the Leonardo da Vinci program in London, and then also the ATP Senior Tour Championship, which was a tournament with all the, former stars, the McEnroe, the Bjorn Borg, the Yannick Noah, which is a generation probably of players that you have not heard about. Then I became, the international sponsorship manager of Sanex, who was the international sponsorship, title sponsor of the WTA Tour, Sanex, the shower gel, company. So I did travel the world, on the women's tennis tour representing Sanex, so more like a sponsorship role. Then I actually arrived in Barcelona. That was back in 2005. And I worked for Group Activa that was doing some corporate incentive and team building, activities. And then I've joined Octagon, based in Barcelona, in Sant Sadurní d'Anoia, exactly. And I became the operations director of the ATP 500 in Valencia, in the City of Arts and Science, and the Andalusia Tennis Experience in Marbella, and also, worked on the FIBA 3-on-3 World Tour. Then I joined Newsly to become, their country representative in Brazil for the FIFA Confederations Cup back in 2013. And this is, probably where the tipping point, how do we end up, putting sustainability in everything that I do. I think, I was at that time 41, right, in the middle of my career, more or less, and then wanted to know, what's next. We didn't win, unfortunately, any projects, with Newsly for the Confederations Cup. Newsly, it's a big temporary structure company specialized in big overlay projects. We didn't win any contracts. I went back into Barcelona and then decided, to work with Seven Mila, who is another event management company that is doing the Extreme in Barcelona that you may have heard, big like a urban festival, in not Porto Olimpico, which is, the other one, the other harbor, which is up north. You probably know what it is. And then, this is where I've started, studying to specialize in sustainability, doing master degree in sustainability development and corporate social responsibility at the AOE, the Escuela de Organización Industrial. And then from there, I've started, We Green, which is a consultancy looking at helping companies in, getting sustainability embedded into their organization. Did a small project for the Circuit of Barcelona, Then the operations director position was available. So from consultant, I became their chief strategy officer and operations director. And from there, I ended up, coming at Silverstone, as a head of ESG. All right. So I don't know if there is any question so far. I will, get straight, into the second part, so let's talk about sustainability in sports. But before anything, does anyone could tell me, or define what sustainability is? I don't know, Pedro, how it works. Do we give, the mic to people if someone, wants to jump in or not? I guess, you're in charge of the production there. But if there is nobody raising their hand, I will keep going. All right? Okay, keep going. So sustainability, that's usually, what we talk about when we want to define sustainability. So we refer to the ability to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. All right. So it involves basically balancing environmental, social, and economic factors to ensure long-term well-being on health for both people and the planet. All right. So we seek to protect the environment. Okay. Quite clear. Promote social equity. All right. And ensure economic viability. All right. This is, what we talk, sometimes, about the triple bottom line. Okay. Anybody knows, what the triple bottom line is? I don't see the answers on the chat, so I assume that nobody is interacting with me, but I will go forward. So basically, the triple bottom line when we talk about sustainability is people, planet, profit. Okay, this is how do you end up combining those three elements, and having sustainability in the heart of it. That makes what sustainability development is. All right, a good combination, a good harmony in between those three concepts. That's the triple bottom line. So yes, to them, there would be quite a lot of terms, terminology around sustainability vocabulary. So I think it's important to set up a good base to make sure that you have a good understanding of what those concepts are. So climate change, everybody has heard about climate change, I guess. So climate change refers to significant long-term changes in the Earth climate patterns, particularly the rise in global temperature due to human activities, and the rise in the planet temperature is called global warming. Okay, so basically, there is lots of concentration of greenhouse gas, in the atmosphere. We call them, GHG, greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, but also nitrous oxide, and all those gases that end up, being trapped, from the sun, into the surface, that goes around, our planet. This is what we call, the greenhouse effect that end up, making the temperature, of our planet rising. So obviously, most of the, climate change and the greenhouse effect, the global warming effect, it's something that has been going on, around, the centuries, on Earth. But obviously, the human activities have been accelerating, much more rapidly, the way the climate or the global warming, is evolving. And especially because we burn a lot of fossil fuel, coal, oil, and gas, but also the result of deforestation and industrial processes. So I will share with you, what are the main effects, of climate change. So obviously, we've talked about the rising global temperature. We know, you probably know that, we always strive, to talk about, for how many degrees, on top of the average temperature that we had in the late 19th century that we could consider let's say good enough without having, any big, climate change. But unfortunately, the temperature are rising, much more than 1 degree. And this is, the effect that, we have. So melting ice and rising sea levels. I'm sure you've seen, the glacier and the polar ice, melting. The rising, of the sea levels, obviously thermal expansion, the water warms, it expands, and obviously the melting ice, that have, are causing the, the sea level to rise. And obviously that has an effect, on all the coastal areas that end up being, flooded, increase, of erosions. and the saltwater intrusion into freshwater sources. Ocean acidification, okay, the ocean, absorbs, 30% of the CO2 that we have, on our planet, and produced, by human activity. So more CO2 is absorbed, the water becomes more acidic, which can harm, the marine life, especially species with calcium carbonate shells like the corals and the shellfish, and that threatens biodiversity and the marine, ecosystem. More climate change, unfortunately, affect, the extreme weather events, big heat waves, wildfires, storms and hurricanes, flooding and heavy, rainfall. All that, are just, multiplying, more and more droughts, in, many different regions around the globe. So that's, a mix of those, extreme weather events. And then obviously all that results, in also biodiversity loss and ecosystem disruption. The climate changing is forcing, many species to migrate. People as well, have to migrate, because of, climate change. That change, the behavior of those species, some are facing an extinction, due to habitat loss and changing of environmental conditions, as we've talked about, the coral reefs, the Arctic species and many other freshwater species are extremely, vulnerable. Ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, grasslands are being altered, okay, which reduce, biodiversity and disrupt, food chains. More impact, unfortunately, on agriculture and food security. Obviously, the changing of temperatures, shifting, weather patterns, are becoming more and more frequent, which makes them difficulty, to cultivate, crops, that disrupt the food production. The water available, to obviously water those fields, and that can lead, to food shortage, price, increases, and malnutrition in some regions. Then you've got health impact. Obviously the climate change contributes to a range of health issues, including health-related illness, respiratory, problems, obviously worsening, the air quality, and the spread of vector-borne disease like malaria, dengue, which are, expanding, due to warmer temperature rising. Social and economic disruption. We've talked, briefly about it. It's not only the species, that are being displaced, but then obviously the populations are being displaced. All the rising sea levels and extreme weather events, are forcing millions of people to leave their home. And the coastal communities and small islands nations are especially at risk. Huge economic cost, obviously every time that there is, extreme weather events, that has, big damage, and those damage, obviously impact us a lot, higher cost, to disaster recovery, agriculture losses, infrastructure damages, and obviously healthcare that are more in need. All right, so that's on the climate change and all the different, consequences of that, warming of the temperature. Carbon footprint. What are we talking about, when we hear about carbon footprint? Well, basically, it's the total greenhouse gas emissions caused by individual, event, organization, service, place, product, basically any activity, on the globe end up, generating, greenhouse gas. And this is, what we call, the carbon footprint. So that's a little graph about, the different emissions, and the way they're being, let's say, categorized. We usually talk about scope 1, 2, and 3. Okay, you see the different gases, on the top, of the drawing. And then our scope 1 is our direct emissions, so what, really the organization that you work for, is generating. So when we talk about Silverstone, we have obviously heating and cooking. We've got generators, powering our site. We've got support vehicle. We've got, refrigerant gas in our air conditioning system. And if it would be like a company, like a factory manufacturing, product, that are transformed on site, that will be also the scope 1 emissions. And then the scope 2, as you can see, on your left is, the indirect emissions, which is basically the electricity that you need to power your facility. All right. And then scope 3, you've got direct and indirect emissions, which is basically your supply chain. Okay. This is, a bit better explained here, but again, direct emissions relating to source, emissions. Scope 2, this is basically, what is powering, your facility. And Scope 3, it's basically, your supply chain. So when we talk about, carbon footprint, very quickly, we end up talking about carbon neutrality, net zero. But what's the difference in between the two? All right. So here, is a bit of an explanation. So carbon neutrality, it's usually, an exercise of balancing the emissions that you are generating, okay, mainly via carbon offset. Okay, so you know how much carbon you're generating, and then, you buy credits, basically, that end up compensating, your emissions. But, it doesn't really require any significant emissions reduction. It, yes, usually exclude, Scope 3 emissions, and there is no strict emission reduction target, required. While when we talk about net zero, okay, not only, you try to balance, your emissions, but you're actually trying to remove, your greenhouse gases. So the idea is really to cut down, your emissions, and not only the Scope 1 and 2, but also the Scope 3 to zero, okay, and focuses on permanent carbon removal. Okay, and they have to be aligned with the science-based target, which we'll get to it into a moment, which is trying, to keep, the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees comparing to the late, 19th centuries. So science-based target, so it's providing a clear, defined pathway for companies to reduce, their greenhouse gas, helping to prevent the worst impact of climate change and future-proof business growth. So if you hear about, a company that has set up, their net zero target, and they said that, it's been aligned with the SBTI, which is the Science-Based Target Initiative, well, this is, what it means. So those targets, are considered science-based, if, as I said, they are in line with the latest climate science, that are saying, come on, guys, we need to make sure that we meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is all about limiting global warming, under the 1.5 degrees. Okay, so the Paris Agreement, sure you've talked about it or you've heard about it, sorry, and that was all about to tackle climate change and its negative impact. That was back, I think, in 2015, where during the COP21 in Paris, okay, all the members, all the states were represented, at the Paris, COP21, decided, to agree on long-term goals, to be achieved in order to maintain, that global warming, if possible, below 1.5 degrees, but for sure below 2 degrees, which, we believe that would be, a disaster if we end up, going over. It was, also about enhancing resilience and adaptation to climate impact, and then align, financial flows into the world with these objectives. So that was, in the COP21, sorry, and then the agreement, really entering into force by November 2016. I think, there is 194 states, that have signed the treaty. There was 195 before, but obviously the US has got out. So another thing that, we talk about usually when we talk about, climate change, when we talk about sustainability, it's circular economy. All right. So the circular economy is a model, of production and consumption, which involves sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling existing material and products as long as possible. In this way, the life cycle of product is extended. But rather than having me explaining it to you, I've got a video for you.
We live in a world with finite materials.
We are throwing an awful lot of electronics,
plastic, food, carpets,
clothing
away. It's a waste of precious materials.
If
If we could build an economy that would use things rather than use them up, we could build a future that really could work in the long term.
You design the product in a way that
Can be taken apart. Once the consumer has finished using them,
you remanufacture it and give it out again. You can reduce your production costs hugely if applied correctly.
Instead of garments ending up in landfill,
Companies can repurpose it, reuse it, making profit out of their waste.
We take some resources from nature and bring it back in the form of nutrients.
It's very much a natural cycle.
We use 70% less water than conventional agricultural methods.
Our packaging is not a waste, it's something that you can consume and eat.
We redesign everyday products to make them fully recyclable.
We farm as close to nature as is possible.
The H&M Group has set ambitious targets to use 100% sustainably sourced materials.
There is a lot of conversation about not buying clothes, but different models where you can rent clothing.
We develop fully modular headphones that we offer on a subscription basis.
The circular economy itself is inevitable in my view.
it's not one fix, it's about the entire system being redesigned.
this is to me the only way to fight climate change, to fight pollution, to fight waste.
This is a business model that stacks up.
Global companies cannot survive in the future without transitioning towards a circular economy. That is a really exciting future.
All right. I'm sure that you've heard about, Ellen MacArthur. I mean, she used to be, selling around, the world. And now, she has dedicated a foundation to focus, on circular economy. So another term that we use a lot when we talk about sustainability is ESG. All right. So I'm pretty sure that, most of you know, what those letters mean. But basically, ESG is E for environmental, S for social, and G, for governance. Basically, when we talk about, ESG, for me, it's more like a risk management, so how do you assess, environmental risk, social and governance, risk, that can help you identify all those risks and make sure that, you understand what are your company's vulnerability and, how do you address those risks in order, to be prepared in case they come. Stakeholder expectation, ESG, it's very important, as the stakeholders, including investors, customers, employees, the communities, with whom you're related, expect the business, to operate responsibly and consider the environmental and social impacts. So adopting ESG practices really, helps meet these expectations and maintain positive relationship with the stakeholders. It has to be long-term, okay? So, very important, to have that long-term vision and making sure that whatever you do now, it impacts the present, but also, impact, obviously, the future. So you can make sure that by addressing those issues, your companies can improve operational efficiency, attract and retain talents, enhance your brand reputation, access to new market and investment. So it's a sort of like regulatory compliance, so that's the ESG factors are increasing being incorporated into regulatory frameworks worldwide. And then the companies that align with ESG standard can ensure compliance with existing and future regulation, reducing legal and reputational risk. And then obviously, from an investor's point of view, that gives them, their preference, people, companies, better say, that has, very good, ESG credentials, end up being the perfect, partner for future investment. So certifications, that's another part, of sustainability. And I'm sure that you've seen the coming certification, B Corp. I'm sure you've heard about B Corp, which are purpose-driven brands, which aim to benefit all stakeholders and not just, the shareholders. I'm sure that you know brands that are B Corp certified, like Patagonia or Ben & Jerry's. Fair Trade, I'm sure you've seen that logo many times, which is a trading partnership, which is based on the dialogue, transparency and respect, in between the producer and then the people selling the product that has been cultivated. So then you've got the Rainforest Alliance, which is fairly similar. You've got the FSC. You probably see it lots of products that are based on paper, and the Forest Stewardship Council, that's an international non-governmental organization that promotes responsible forest management. So every time that you need to buy something with paper, make sure that you buy something which is FSC certified. You've got also the fishing, sustainable seafood, certification, the MSC. You've got then, the eco label, that you may have seen in Europe. You've got, the LEED certification. The LEED means, leadership in energy and environmental design. It's mostly used, in the US, and it's usually, rating, green building or rating, the green element of buildings, so it's a green building rating system. You've got the Green Key, which is a certification which is recognized as an eco label, that indicates a tourism establishment commitment to environmental responsibility and sustainable practice. The Hilton Garden Inn, which is a hotel which sits, right in front of the grid here at Silverstone, is Green Key certified. And then you've got the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. I'm going to make it, which makes international rules that are usually focusing on quality, but you've got specific environmental related or sustainability related ISO, which is the ISO 1401 and the ISO 2012-1, okay, which Paris or the London Olympics and the one that actually Silverstone is trying to get by the end of the year. We already have the ISO 1401 here at Silverstone. So very often also when we talk about, sustainability, you hear about, the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's been, adopted, more or less at the same time that, we've heard, the Paris Agreement in 2015. And basically, they've developed 17 goals that are becoming a bit like a sort of a blueprint, for peace and prosperity for the planet and the people, and obviously for the future. So those 17 SDGs were made, to make a very urgent call for action in order, for every organization to think about how they could impact, through their organization, those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Let me share with you a video.
Eight years left to end poverty and hunger, to halve global emissions. It didn't start out as planned. We're not moving in the right direction. Years of progress lost in the pandemic. Escalating conflicts, climate breakdown. So where are we now? For decades, we successfully fought poverty. Now it's on the rise, again. 1 out of 10 suffer from hunger, more people than ever forced out of their homes. Climate disasters increasing. Droughts alone estimated to displace 700 million people by 2030. This year, CO2 emissions hit a new record. At this rate, annual emissions will be 14% higher in 2030. Meanwhile, fossil energy receives $700 billion in subsidies from governments.
Your
Safe water and sanitation not made accessible fast enough. Progress must quadruple to cover all people by 2030. Women are held back at all levels. At this pace, by 2030, 825 million children won't have secondary level education. Human rights, health, and equality all hurt in the wake of war and disaster. Disrupted economies, food and energy crisis, and galloping costs of living damage global solidarity. Everything interconnected. Everyone intertwined. Business as usual won't cut it. Even though we made progress before, going back to pre-pandemic ways is not enough. We need a new paradigm built on the pillars of our 17 goals. Rethink conventions, flip the orthodoxies. Governments, organizations, corporations, citizens of the world, snap out of it. It's time for bold climate action. To act for women and girls, for social justice and inclusion. Scale up the transition to renewable energy. Create 85 million green jobs. Phase out fossil fuel subsidies and tax carbon. $2.8 trillion. Keep your promises. Support developing nations. Write off debts. Free up $1 trillion for climate resilience, people, and communities. $500 billion for Africa to achieve universal energy access by 2030. Commit to a circular economy now. New, resilient food systems. They can cut waste by 17%. Strengthen domestic financial institutions. Make insurance and banking accessible to everyone. Scale up the digital transformation to educate the 1.6 billion kids who missed school in the pandemic. Educate girls, including the 130 million not in school now. Ensure women's equal share of decision-making. Eliminate discrimination against female workers and boost productivity by 40%. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind. We have a to-do list. We have the resources. 8 years to reach our goals. We're on this planet together, so let's work together. Let's get the list done.
So that video was made in 2022, but you can imagine that, everything that you've heard about me, in the last, 5 minutes, it's still very much, about the present, and there is a lot, to be done, and there is a lot that you can do, you as a, current, managers, within the company that you're working for, to make sure that the SDG or, sustainability is fully embedded in everything that you do, to make sure that your work, your organizations, activities make, a positive impact, for the people and for the planet, on top, obviously, of being financially sustainable. So let's get into the sport industry a bit more. We don't have, much left, 20 minutes, and anything that won't be talked about today will be, talked, in next month's, little presentation that we'll have. But I wanted to focus on the sport industry. Obviously, this is, where I've been involved, for more than 20 years now. So just, to give you, a bit of an idea of the numbers, So when we talk about, the sports industry, we usually said that, it represents a global market of $500 to $600 billion. Not bad, Media rights, 50 to 60 billion, sponsorships, 50 to 70 billion, merchandising, 20 to 30, ticket sales, 20 to 30. All right. Obviously, the events industry, I mean, the sports industry, you know, is very much related to those big events that you see on your screen now. The FIFA World Cup, the Olympic Games, NFL, NBA, Premier League, F1, PGA, tennis, you know. The motorsports industry, that is more related to me, obviously, you know, represent 18 to $90 billion. You know, the NFL alone, you know, represent up to 20 billion. Esports, you know, it's 1.5 billion already, you know, which is almost what Formula One is, you know, by itself. Okay. But the market value, you know, of Formula One is over, you know, 20 million now. Opportunities, well, actually, I mean, you know, the sports industry employ more than 5 to maybe 6 million people across the globe and up to 2 million in Europe. So there are definitely lots of opportunity within the world of sports, within the world of entertainment, within the world of event in general, you know, for you to may, you know, potentially have a career there. But it's true that, you know, it generates a great, you know, amount of carbon footprint, you know, 350 million metric tons of CO2 annually. That's a lot. Obviously, I mean, the world of sports, the world of event, it's all about people going to stadium, you know, athletes and officials traveling, you know, from one place to another. So what can we do, you know, to make sure that the sport industry, you know, rather than contaminating even more, can actually demonstrate it can reduce its, you know, its carbon footprint, and obviously be a platform for change. And this is, you know, what Nelson Mandela, I mean, was saying, you know, already, I mean, decades ago. We know that sport has the power to change the world. Obviously, here he was very much more talking about people, right? But I think, I mean, it's all about, you know, that passion, you know, the power that sports has, you know, to unite people, you know, and obviously sports can awake, you know, hope, you know, can obviously, you know, transform despair into passion, okay? And if you speak to people the way, I mean, sport speaks to people, okay, then we can also talk about sustainability, make sure that, you know, that language is fully understand, and then can create, you know, the change that we need. So, you know, when we talk about sustainability in sports, you know, we need to go back a little bit, you know, to the origins, you know. So back 1992, the Earth Summit started establishing the UN Agenda 21. Lillehammer, I mean, it's true that the IOC has always been extremely, you know, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, and the Olympic Games have always been, you know, a great platform to test, you know, how sustainability could be embedded, you know, into those events. So they started, you know, having some environmental consideration. Then, you know, IOC amended the Olympic Charter and established the environment as the third pillar of Olympism, alongside sport and culture. 2000 Sydney Olympics, you know, the Games started incorporating environmental thinking, you know, in every aspect of the event. The Turin Winter Olympics, you know, included environmental concern, not only, I mean, you know, for the event itself, but for the lead up to the event and the legacy, you know, of the Olympic Games in Turin. Then in 2010, you know, an independent environmental assessment, you know, of the Beijing 28, you know, was published by the UNEP, which led, you know, the London Olympics, you know, to be the first Olympic Games being certified by the ISO 20021, which is an event sustainability management system. All right, it's voluntary, yes, but it helps you or help them in any sports organization to have, you know, a guidelines, a framework to report on, you know, which is all standardized, I mean, within the world of event management. Not only sports, I mean, also, I mean, festival, concerts can be ISO 20021. Then Paris, you know, was certified by the new version of the ISO 20021 last year. So this is, you know, the you know, a little bit, you know, the Olympic Agenda 2020 that, you know, starting putting, you know, sustainability in the heart of the IOC strategy, you know, alongside, you know, credibility, sustainability in youth. Various recommendations, you know, that are, you know, specifically related to sustainability, which is the recommendation 4 and 5, which is, you know, fairly high in all the different, you know, recommendations that, you know, the sustainability strategy of the IOC has. So, you know, really starting, you know, thinking about putting sport at the service of the humanity. This has been refreshed, obviously, after 2020, the 2020 plus 5, with another 15 recommendations. And, the first 6 that you can see, on your screen, very much, having sustainability, integrity, fully integrated, embedded, in that Olympic agenda, and making sure that, the sport can be, that leverage platform, to engage with the younger audience, to make sure that then we can talk about positive impact within the sports community, and try, to evolve and adapt, the evolving societal, environmental, and technological needs. So that was, the IOC agenda, which was very much focusing on reducing the emissions. So they've got that target to reduce, direct and indirect emissions, by 2030. Compensating some of the emissions you've seen before, the net zero, the carbon neutral. So the IOC is doing a bit of a mix. There is a reduction plan, but there is also, a compensating plan by creating, that green forest, in the middle of Africa. And obviously using the influence and encourage, all stakeholders related to the Olympics, and the fans especially, to take actions, against climate change. The other framework that you may have heard about is Sports for Climate Action. Okay, that is, very much asking all the sports organizations and their stakeholders to take action to tackle, climate change. And there's a little video that talks about it.
The people have spoken. Leaders of the world, you must lead. The continuation of our civilizations and the natural world upon which we depend is in your hands.
Climate change is actually having a really big effect, not only on winter sport, but summer sport. This is something that only isn't affecting the playing field. It's causing spectators not wanting to show up. It makes it difficult on athletes. This affects everybody.
That IOC is one of the institutions of the world that can have the most beneficial impact on how the world addresses climate change.
Sport is one of the unique things that brings the entire world together to change the world for better. And we need to do that for climate change.
This initiative will provide the sports world with the support it needs to help the global community to win the race against climate change.
Today, more than ever before, we are committed through the UN Sports for Climate Action framework to a successful and more sustainable sport.
We very much appreciate the leadership and the efforts of the IOC in order that we can really share best practices and be as effective as possible.
This is really the way for us to officially move ahead and take part.
Join Sports for Climate Action.
Together, let's win the race against climate change.
All right, so that gives you a bit of an idea of what, in 2019, how was, the UNFCCC, starting gathering, all those sports organizations behind that framework, with those key principles, which basically is trying to undertake systematic efforts to promote greater environmental responsibility, reduce overall climate impact, educate, for climate action, promote sustainable and responsible consumption, and advocate for climate action through communication. So the big target, when you understand, or to understand, what the UNFCCC is all about, the target is reducing by 50% the carbon emissions by 2030, and then aiming to achieve net zero by 2040. You've seen, some example of the signatories, of that, at the end of the video, signing that pledge, making a plan, proceeding in action, making sure that, you actually, activate, the plan. It's not just, commitment, or it's just not a promise. You actually need to make a real commitment and put together an action plan and report on a yearly basis. So Silverstone has signed and joined, the UNFCCC, as the World Athletics, the International Olympic Committee, Arsenal, the Judo Federation, International Federation, the NBA, the Tennis Federation in France, the FIBA, University of Miami. Well, you can see, lots of different organizations that have signed, the UNFCCC, the FIA, Wimbledon. So all those are signatories of UNFCCC that meet, every year at Sports Positive, which is an event, in London that regroup, all the stakeholders involved in sports, that put sustainability in everything that they do. There is another framework that is quite, recent, December 22, which is called Sport for Nature, which has, the principle of trying to protect nature and avoid damage to natural habitats and species, restore and regenerate nature wherever possible, understand and reduce risk to nature in your supply chains, and educate and inspire positive action for nature across and beyond sport. And because I know that you love videos, well, you've got another one.
Sports depend on nature. Grass or clay, city or country, mountains or oceans. Where we play is integral to what we love. We share these playgrounds with the wildlife and plants that sustain our world. But our global arena is at risk. But with the right teamwork, we can be part of the solution. In sport is in our nature. With the same goal in mind, committing to each other and to something bigger than ourselves, we can change the game like never before and protect both nature and the sports we love. Sports for Nature is bringing together a global community of sports organizations taking action for nature. No matter what or where you play, this affects all of us, and it will take all of us to make a difference together.
So stay tuned, because, maybe soon we'll make an announcement about, Sport for Nature at Silverstone. Here is a couple of organizations that you could have a look at, that really embed sustainability or drive sustainability, in sports. BASIS, which is the British Association of Sustainability for Sustainable Sports. Forever Green, which is, the foundation, with Betis Seville. Sports and Sustainability, called also SAMSI, Global Sustainable Sports. EcoSport, which is a great portal. Anybody who wants to get, a job, within the world of sport that has sustainability related to it, that's a good platform to look at. Sports Positive, I talked about it, that, event, the first or second week of October in London, Great Sports Alliance, which has almost all big sports organizations in the US, being part of that alliance, or the Sports Environment Alliance, which is more like in Asia and Australia. And then to finish, all the ISO, which is that Sustainable Event Management System, that end up, giving the possibility to organizations that decide to be ISO 20001 to have that framework, that guidelines, that really help them in being as transparent, putting integrity, inclusivity, stewardship, into, the organization. It's all about, transparency, all about, good governance, making sure that, you actually have the evidence, proving that the processes that you put in place, are really in place. And then you always try, to have continuous improvement and a good, risk management. So before, getting into Silverstone, Shift to Zero, which we will, next, months, in the coming event, maybe I can stop sharing and open the floor for questions. Pedro? All right, let me have a look. Okay. Greetings from Ecuador. Well, nice to meet you. Zulema. What about the ISO 1401? Well, I will talk about the 1401 during, the case study, next month. People won't believe that every small action counts. We can change, our future. Definitely. We always say, act local, but think global. Every single action that we end up doing in our day-to-day has an impact. So think about that impact. So we'll talk more about it, in the Shift, to Zero case study, next month. But I always talk about, we are what we buy. So if you start thinking, what the impacts are of every single thing that you buy every day, then you realize that, yes, your actions can have, a greater impact. Any other question? I do think, Zulema, that sports, really is has a role to play. We've talked about the figures, of the revenue, that the sports, moves around the world. The number of people involved in sports, and then I think, there is some statistic that says that almost one person out of two, so 50% of the population, has sports, somehow. Within his life. Is it something that they watch on TV? Is it something that, they consume on social media? Is it something that they practice themselves? So, sports is everywhere, almost in everybody's life. And I think, if sport can demonstrate that we can manage, sports in the most, sustainable way, then, we've got that effect, of changing behavior of all those sports fans, sports stakeholders that we have. And then hopefully, change, the world, or at least, make a better impact, a positive impact, within our planet and our people. So, thanks a lot. I think we had until 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock your time, or wherever you are around the globe. It's been a pleasure, but let's all meet, at the end of next month. All right, just before the British Grand Prix here at Silverstone. Thanks a lot for your attention. See you next month. Thank you.